Existential Counselling as a Theoretical Framework for Sport Coaching by Harvey Anderson of Sheffield Hallam University. So firstly, I'd like to start off with the question, why do people get involved with sport? For Nelson Mandela, it's clear that he sees sport as an incredibly powerful agent for change. As he says, sport has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. Sport can awaken hope where there was previously only despair. Sport speaks to people in a language that they can understand. Powerful stuff. For me, people get involved with sport for a number of reasons. Personally, for the love of sport, for the love of the game, for the love of completing. The passion involved with being part of a team, a competition, etc. The commitment that both you hold for your sport and your sport in many respects holds for you. For many people, sport is part of their identity. It's amazing how many people we meet and we talk to them and say, "Oh, what do you do?" Etc. "Oh, well, I'm a footballer, I'm a rugby player, I play cricket," etc. The friendships and bonds and relationships that we build with sport, again, cannot be underplayed. These are friendships quite often for life that make a difference. And for some people, it feels like it's their destiny. They have a dream as a young child to go and be, for example, an Olympic gold medalist or a World Cup footballer or whatever it is. So what do we actually gain from sport then? Well, one of the things that sport has levelled at it for it to be able to produce and to achieve, firstly, character development, so courage, creativity, etc. Or if we get into Haskins' 5 C's, these are supposedly things that sport can help us develop, along with leadership, great leadership skills, experience. Sport allows us or teaches us about that. Sport should hopefully also teach us about fair play. And this idea that keeps coming back to us time and time again. The sport is about moral and ethical development. Sport can also give us recognition, and quite rightly so, for some people who either commit their life to the sport itself, for playing, for coaching, for administration, etc., or for high level success, etc., affords some form of recognition. For many people, sport can be an escapism, both the short term and in the long term. So it can help people escape poverty, abuse, and a whole host of really other negative things. It can also just be a great escapism for a day, to get past workplace stress, etc. As mentioned before, we can gain an identity. People become sporty, in inverted commas, which should then hopefully lead to lifelong physical activity. As for many people, they choose not to be physically active because they're not sporty. Well, conversely, for those who are sporty, there's more of a chance for that. So, where are these things written about in sports coaching, and particularly where are they covered in coach education? Now, and I'm sure a number of you will be thinking there, well, I know a paper of this, I know a paper of that. But interestingly, if you go into Google Scholar, or if you go into your own searches from your libraries, when you look up sports coaching and how to coach love, how to coach the passion of sport, you might get some things that you weren't expecting, but they're not the things that we're actually talking about here. So where are they? Where in coach education, when you do your coach education courses, is the element of how to build love and passion in your athletes, how to get them to see sport as a positive part of their identity, how to help people escape poverty. Not delivered, not taught. So why is there a sparsity here? Well, there are a number of reasons. Firstly, we might look at the current paradigms that are in sports coaching. So we have a large amount of cognitive psychology, sociological work and behavioural stuff, and even critical realist work as it started to predominate within the literature. And they're great. They teach us certain things. So, for example, cognitive psychology will teach us about coaches' thoughts. The sociology side will start to look at the complexities of coaching and the different levels and hierarchies and so on that impact on coaches and their choices. Again, critical realism looks to unpick real issues and the many layers of issues that impact upon sports coaching and give it its complexity. Now, while they're really useful, they don't really get into this kind of the subjective experience. What's it actually like as a human being, as a person, to be part of this sport? And they rarely tell us really why coaches, why athletes make the choices that they do. From a cynical perspective, we might also suggest that, well, this stuff that I'm talking about, there are no drills for that. There are no coloured cones and ladders that you can put out, nice bibs that you can wear to increase somebody's passion for the sport. There are no phone apps. You can't get a YouTube guide. This is how you make your athletes love their sport that little bit more. Okay, so it's fair to say that it's not really current practice or standardized process that you can copy to enhance some of this kind of much deeper stuff that we're talking about here. So maybe there's time for something else. Maybe this very philosophical standpoint might have some ontological position that we can latch onto to help us to develop these areas within our athletes and within our coaches. So an ideology, a philosophy that I would really like to introduce to the sports coaching world is that of existentialism. Now, there are many different types of existentialists and therefore many different existential definitions and approaches. One central premise of existentialism is that each human being has a responsibility for giving meaning to their lives. So life is about understanding and creating meaning for yourself on your own level, not something from external processes such as society or religion. Existentialism, whilst noting this freedom and this responsibility, we must understand that this is situated freedom. We don't have free carte blanche to go and do what we want. There are certain constraints and affordances available to us, to use dynamical systems language. We also consider existentialism as an ethical theory. There's a large discussion point throughout in terms of moral and ethical development and moral and ethical judgments. Okay, so this is about values and about judgments and about what it is to be a human and maintain good high quality levels of values. Existential writers also call for a priority over ontology, i.e. how we live, the human being, and I'll come back to emphasize that a little bit more later, but it's our being as a human that leads us to our knowledge and knowing how to do something and how to have things. Existentialists call us to lead an authentic life, and this authenticism is something that keeps coming back again in existential writing. It's about the quality in which we live our lives. Are we living our life by our values, by our beliefs, leading to our emotions, something that we are happy with, that is right for us? Not that something else has given us, be it our parents, our coach, our family, our religion, our country's leaders or whatever. It's about, can we understand ourselves and live a life in a way that we are happy with, that we are proud of? Okay, so Mandich 2012 points out it's great to have wisdom and opinions of others and knowledge to help us along the way, but it's our responsibility to find our authentic selves and to live our authentic lives. It's, without going too deep, this is kind of really critical if we're going to overcome what we call existential anxiety, existential angst, this fear of death, etc. We need to live our life with courage and creativity. And again, these are common existential topic points that keep coming back time and time again: courage and creativity. But yet, we talk about this a lot in sport. We really value our courageous players, those who put it all on the line. We love our creative, individualized players. But what do we do to actually encourage that in our coaching? So existential philosophy is a philosophy that really puts its essence on what it is about being human being through their existence, what it means to be human. So we examine human beings rather than human doings or human thinkings. So we don't just look at what a coach or a player or athlete does. We look at what they are being, who they are, what those meanings are, those values that are put in there. So meanings and values leading to emotions are critical in our existence and the quality of our existence. And this is what we as existentialists seek to uncover. We need to understand humans, and we seek to see what it's like to be a human who is fallible in many ways, but still has to have courage to take on an authentic life. So existentialism has strong links with phenomenology, but it's by no means defined or confined to this school of thought. There are many different approaches to existentialism. There are also some strong links with humanism and with pragmatism. There are subtle differences, and we will pick those later. But again, we're looking at the human beings as a human. We're looking for the appropriate solutions for that individual. So again, there are links with those thoughts. Something that's quite often thrown at existentialists, particularly if you follow any Woody Allen movies, etc., is that there's a kind of great emphasis and focus on life and death, particularly the death. So we talk about, we're born, we exist, but we're always existing towards our inevitable demise. We're always heading towards death. So it's about how do we live our lives with the small amount of time we have allocated to us. Responsibility and freedom keep coming back time and time again. But again, we might discuss here that it's the exercise of freedom and the ability to shape the future that distinguishes man from all other beings. It's through this free and responsible decisions that man becomes authentically himself. So it's not about following a religious doctrine. It's about you understanding yourself and living your life by your values. So the key themes that kind of come out that we again keep talking about. So authenticity, as mentioned before, freedom, responsibility, courage and creativity. Okay, this idea of destiny. We're on this planet for a certain period of time. What we were born to do, and do we live our lives towards what we were born to do? This idea of moral and ethical judgment throughout. Are we living our lives in the way that we think we should be living in terms of moral and ethical judgments? There's a lot of talk of love, relationships, passions, and so on. Again, these are strong topic points, key themes of existentialism. But as we alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, these are the things that we also, the reason why we play sport. We love sport. We love our teams. We love the battle, the intensity, etc. Also, some of the negatives, this anxiety. We have to face anxiety. And existential authors such as Rollo May talk a lot about the importance of anxiety. Without anxiety, we don't have the drive to actually get out and do something. If we didn't have anxiety, we wouldn't probably get out of bed in the morning. We'd have no reason to. There's nothing to fear. We could just lay there without taking responsibility. So anxiety is really important, as is will. The will to do something. Do we have the willpower? And again, another common theme. Some famous existentialists, for those who wish to read further, some quite famous names, a number of who actually spent their life claiming not to be existentialists. So Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre spoke a lot. Viktor Frankl, again, fascinating guy for those of you unaware of his story, was held in a concentration camp by the Nazis, and it's about his understanding of having a reason to live and the power of meaning and having a reason why, etc. Merleau-Ponty, and then my personal favourite, Rollo May, who speaks of a genuine love, I think, of human beings and how we should go about living our lives and dealing with those difficult questions. So, all sounds really grand, Harvey, but what's this got to do with coaching? Well, existential counselling has started to move its way into the coaching arena. It's being used more and more in terms of the workplace, and people bring it more in terms of life coaching, etc. So it's starting to bridge that gap. As long as we know our boundaries, where each of them sits, there's no reason why this can't then take this next step into becoming sports coaching. So existential approaches have been used in psychology, psychiatry, counselling and coaching. The therapeutic side tends to look at the trauma and distress and pathology, whereas we're looking at self-development, self-discovery and working towards future projects. Counselling tends to involve conversations which are focused on kind of emotional issues and conflicts. We're looking more at the solutions of that in terms of coaching. Existentialism has been discussed quite a lot in sport, in various areas. Linked more to sports psychology in terms of how you take that therapeutic counselling role as a sports psychologist, but again very limited in coaching. Bori and colleagues have produced a really nice paper looking at kind of elite development and lived experiences of elite development, which is great, and obviously holds an existentialist perspective, but doesn't then take the next steps to get into, well, what are the pedagogical approaches that are appropriate for this approach to talent development, etc., that you're actually looking at. So some of the things that existential coaching, so workplace life coaching, that some of the things that these existentialists talk about that makes good coaching. Well, good existential coaching needs to honour individuality. It needs to value responsibility taking. It encourages choice and choice making. It doesn't shy from the conflict and confrontation. There's a key emphasis to actually get things in place and to actually try them out and to live these things. It's about creating and sustaining authentic relationships between the coach and, in this case, the client. We need to anticipate there's going to be anxiety and defensiveness. We're asking the deep and meaningful, powerful questions, so you're going to get some form of anxiety, you're going to get defensiveness, you're going to get some roadblocks along the way. You need to welcome and appreciate the absurd. It may be absurd to you, but we're dealing with human beings' lives and how they see the world. So it's their life. It's not for us to decide whether something's absurd. We have to commit to something, and coaching is, in an existential perspective, about doing that, with the key figure of being that our clients must figure out their own way. Now, I'm hoping that a number of you listening to this will already go, hang on a minute, that sounds really familiar. That sounds just like athlete-centered coaching or even autonomous supportive coaching. Well, you'd be right. It is, very much so. But those approaches are kind of based around humanism and self-determination theory, which is great. But if we're being a little bit critical of these things, humanism expects humans as an object and is quite idealistic in nature. Unfortunately, coaching doesn't work that way. You only have to look at kind of Lyle work and Cushion's work and various others that point out the real kind of, the messy dark waters of coaching and what it's about. Okay, so unfortunately, this only goes to a certain level. I would suggest that the existentialism as a philosophy and ontology might be more appropriate. It's still humanistic, it still can deal with, and is very much aligned to dealing with subjective realities. It more closely and more powerfully brings about ethical and moral development questions, which, with all the will in the world, looking at some of the latest scandals that have been going on in the world, certainly in the UK, with the Athlete A series and a number of issues of abuse and so on are coming out. These are really important questions for sports coaching and must be addressed. So existentialism can deal with all this stuff that we've talked about in terms of athlete-centered coaching and autonomous supportive coaching, but also gets to this nitty-gritty of ethical and moral development and the practical realities of sports coaching rather than idealism. So what does this involve? Well, firstly and primarily, communication with your athletes, and that's a two-way thing. So I guess you're going to need to talk to your athletes. You're going to need to understand them. You're going to need to question them. You're going to need to build relationships. These are all critical. Even more so, and this is where it becomes tough, particularly for the coach, is you need to model authenticity in your own coaching and your life. If you cannot act in an authentic way, if you cannot live by your values, if you cannot be brave enough and have the courage and creativity to find yourself, then how can you ask your athletes to follow that same really anxiety-provoking process? So we need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to have a methodology of coaching, a pedagogy that actually aligns to our ontology. So it's using pedagogical approaches that foster self-development, awareness, communication, and questioning. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples. Firstly, we're going to look at how we go about developing physical literacy and why I certainly believe, amongst other people, that physical literacy development is an existential quest. We're going to look at elite athlete development, and again, why this life journey is really important. We can tackle from an existentialist perspective. And then finally getting into this kind of idea of transformational leadership and where existentialism can fit both for coaching and of coaching. So firstly, developing physical literacy. Hopefully most of you have read this really good recent paper by Richard Bailey looking at physical literacy and the real issues in and around the concept, particularly the definitions and how people are using a number of different definitions and approaches to try and suggest that the same thing, whether they're not necessarily so. For this, I'm going to use Whitehead's definition, which is physical literacy can be described as the motivation, confidence, physical competence, knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for engaging in physical activity for life. So it's not just about skills here. We're talking about the physical and psychological development of this person to hopefully imbue motivation to be active for life. So, if we're to engage people in physical literacy for life, we are setting this skill set, knowledge and attitude as part of one's identity. Thus, it can be argued that the development of physical literacy is an existential endeavour. It's about know thyself. Know how you move. Know how you want to move. Know what you value to be good movement skills. Know how these fit. Understanding why these attributes are important to building towards a physical literacy for life, this physical activity for life and in older life. So, where again is the literature on this? Again, it's limited, but that because it's not there doesn't mean to say we can't use it or shouldn't use it. So how do we go about addressing this? Well, as mentioned previously, we have to match up our ontology with our methodology as we would in research. It's exactly the same in coaching practice. Our philosophy to coaching, the ontology of our coaching practice, must align to the pedagogical processes and practices that we use. Now, existential philosophy can drive this pedagogical practice, and for me there is a clear alignment with non-linear pedagogy. So non-linear pedagogy follows the principles of dynamical systems, and it recognises that the long-term directions of elite athletes in all sports, across all ages, are very, very individualised and highly, highly complex. And they follow a complex systems approach. So we need a pedagogy that can deal with that, and that needs to align to our overpanning, our overriding philosophy of existentialism. So our pedagogical practice I'm looking to promote here for engaging and developing physical literacy in our young athletes is this non-linear, or sometimes referred to as constraints-led approach. Now, the reason why we need existentialism to fit with non-linear pedagogy and constraints-led approaches for physical literacy is that, unfortunately, they only tend to really deal with skill acquisition. Whilst complex and whilst it picks out the many, many different issues and that fits into the system that impact on the athlete and their lives, etc., and the environment, it doesn't completely cover holistic development. It doesn't start to question, when gaining physical literacy, while gaining skills, where our moral and ethical judgments may also come into gaining those skills. By combining nonlinear pedagogy and existential philosophy, we can do that. So an existentialist sport coaching approach does both. So, moving on from just physical literacy, which tends to be considered as a child-only grassroots thing, let's start to consider elite athlete development. So Holtberg and Schofield also produced a model for elite development based on development science and practitioner experience. Our discussions of physical literacy development also hold true for athlete development. One area that's not synonymous with elite athlete development is moral and ethical development. We mentioned it before in terms of our developing athlete. Know thyself. Also know thy moral and ethical code. Know how we expect to be seen by the world in terms of our choices and what we do, and learn to have the courage to stand up for those morals and values and beliefs. Okay, so I could easily spend a week talking about kind of ethical and moral development based in around existentialist thought. For me, one of the key issues that we've got is that it's a nice to have quite often. It's a tag on. It's very, very rare. So, for example, if you think about any of the coach education, coach development workshops you've ever done, how many of them engage with moral and ethical development? How many engage in know thyself? How many engage in processes of self-discovery? I know from my experience, having been involved in coach education and coaching for 25 years plus, there's very little. Existentialists call for an authentic life. In order to do that, we need to act and live in a way that we believe to be right and appropriate, and that needs to be modelled at all stages by the coaches. Now, in elite athlete development, that is something that is not always seen. It's tough, not least, and certainly in elite sport, there's an environment of win first and foremost. The rest's nice, but win first and foremost and worry about the other stuff later. But at what point do we say that that's okay? At what point do we say that's acceptable? One of the questions I constantly ask my students, particularly undergrads, is what's an appropriate age group to start coaching gamesmanship and cheating? Most look at me like I've absolutely lost the plot. But then I'll ask the question, so your football team gives away a penalty. Your player kicks the ball away from an area where the free kick's been cancelled to buy your defence more time. Is that acceptable? Most people say, well, yeah, it's gamesmanship. It's not against the rules. I'll then ask, is that against the spirit of the game? And they will say, well, yes. I say, if the opposition do that against you, are you happy with that? No, of course not. We'd complain. Why would you complain? Because it's cheating. Well, there you go. So my question then follows. So at what point do we teach our athletes? And if we're not stopping 8, 9, 10-year-old athletes kicking the ball away or knocking it away in basketball, etc., if we don't start teaching it, if we allow it, we're starting to get through that process of cheating. When do we stop doing that? Now, for some athletes, they may be happy to do that and still live an authentic life. They may view that that is perfectly acceptable, that fits within their moral code, and they're happy to do that. Whereas others would see that as blatant cheating and a non-authentic life choice. So, taking this further, finally, this transformational leadership, existentialism for coaching and of coaching. So, I'm hopeful it's pretty clear to see that this isn't an easy path to tread. It's not an easy approach. It's something that you've got to wrestle with and unpick. It's also quite deep. Many of if you try and read people like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche and so on, Sartre, I've certainly found very difficult. Rollo may possibly less so. So it's tough to understand. It's tough to live. It's not easy for us to engage in authentic lifestyles. But if we can't do it, it's very difficult to expect our athletes to be able to do it. But if we value it, if we see the value and the purpose and the real gains that we get from this approach, we've got to start doing it little by little. Van Deurzen, who's a common writer, particularly in existential coaching, kind of life coaching, talks about this idea, this whole paradox of you have to really lose yourself in order to actually find yourself. If you've never been through or come close to the gates of hell, if you've never been lost, then how on earth do you know who you are? If you've never really been challenged to the core, if you've never been through tough times, you've never got through the other side, you don't know yourself. So you need to experience that. You need to live that. You need to face those, which again calls time and time again for this concept of courage, something that we value so much in sport, but yet talk so little about. Something that we have very, very little input in terms of our pedagogy and our approaches. An excellent book for those of you who like to read is Rollo May's The Courage to Create, where he talks about this idea of life and death, and where artists in particular have to kill off what is now, what is kind of seen as a good approach to art, etc., and destroy that by bringing in something new. That's how art moves forward, that's how sport moves forward. Rather than just doing what everybody else does, having the courage to start again and facing our anxiety, face our fears, stepping out of our comfort zones and having the courage to go forward. So, this calls for an awareness and a prioritization of the philosophy to coach education, to coaching practices. It's something that's almost like an intro topic quite often in coach education. It's the back end of chapter 15 of a 15-chapter sports coaching book. It's not chapter number 1. It's not the purpose of the book. We need to say, well, no more. This has to become a priority. Not only do we as individual coaches need to start living an authentic life and practicing authentic existential sports coaching practice, we need a community of other coaches. This needs to become the new normal, if you like. Again, this calls for massive amounts of courage, not only from athletes, but from coach educators, from coaches, from sports governing bodies, from government ministers, from every individual as a whole, to start moving towards this if we are to enable our athletes to live better, higher quality, authentic lives. So, my turn to leave you with a few questions. Firstly, answer this. Are you actually brave enough? Do you have the courage to do what you believe to be the right thing? Do you have the courage to create authentic athletes and use authentic coaching practices in order to do that? Or will we take the easy approach? Get the same cones out, run the same drills, tell our athletes to do the same things, encourage them to kick the balls away, to cheat, for gamesmanship? Choice is yours. A few final thoughts. The one thing that I've really enjoyed with my kind of quest to understand existentialism more is this whole idea of storytelling and the power of myth, and how existentialists actually use mythology as a way of proof, which I found kind of hard as coming from a science background. People using a story, some fiction, to actually convey a meaning. And that's possibly due to its literary connections, but many existentialists use the power of myth and storytelling to convey a message. Stories of past champions, mythical heroes, fictional characters can all carry a message. So, for example, what's the moral of this story? I'm sure you're all aware of it. I'm sure most of you have seen it. If not, watch it. It's good. But this whole idea, the story of Dumbo, can very, very, very easily be moved over into the world of sport. The athlete, the magic feather given them to give them the courage to actually use their strengths, their talents and their skills to be able to fly. And a personal one. Rocky Balboa has probably inspired me to do more training sessions and work harder than any other person, character, myth or anything else in the history of my life. For those of you who've kind of watched the last of the series, the Rocky Balboa story, there's quite a powerful speech that Rocky gives to his son, where he basically says, don't make excuses. Life's tough, life's hard, life's going to hit you and it's going to knock you down. But that's not important. What is important is taking that and keep moving forward. It's not about running away, it's about moving forward with everything being thrown at you. And if you can do that, that's how we win. Thank you for your listening.